Hey everybody. So I know that this video might make some people a little bit uncomfortable, and I'm sorry about that, but I hope you hear me out. I posted a video a couple days ago that got quite a response in the comments, and I think we just have to talk about it. And in that video, I told the story of a conversation that I had with a friend of mine who's a sincere Christian, and he's also a Trump supporter. And every time I talk about Christian Trump supporters, I get a lot of comments from people who truly just can't understand how a sincere Christian could vote for Donald Trump. And I'm guessing that if you're asking that question, you probably just haven't come from my sort of background. I'm personally surrounded by I think sincere Christians who support Trump. And I think most of my extended family have voted for him 3 times. And that's heartbreaking to me. The churches that I've belonged to in the past are probably evenly split, I think, between Trump supporters and opponents. So these are my people. And even though I disagree strongly with them about Trump and the MAGA movement, I think they do deserve to be understood on their own terms, even when we disagree. I want to disagree on their terms a little bit in fairness. So I hope that I can build some understanding today because I just think we're in a crisis as a nation. I think the levels of corruption and abuse in the Trump administration are already breathtaking, and Trump is already doing serious damage to our nation and to our standing in the world. And I know that people might disagree with me on this, but I really believe that the only way that we get better as a nation is this. I think that we have to find a way to break the hold that Trump and his MAGA movement have over millions of Christians, because it's mostly white conservative Christians who put Trump in power, and they're the ones who keep him in power. So I don't think it's helpful to just dismiss them all as fake Christians and to write them off as unreachable. So I'm going to talk once again here about the elephant in the room, which is abortion. I've talked about this so many times already, and I've written about it at length in both of my books, but it's the issue that won't go away. And for every person who says no one who votes for Trump can be a Christian, I can tell you that there are about 10 people who say no one who votes for any Democrat can be a Christian. And abortion is the main reason that they say that. So when I made that video a couple days ago, I said that my friend wasn't so much a huge fan of Trump's as an opponent of some Democratic policies. And what I didn't say, because I didn't want to take the message off track, is that abortion is the number one reason that he gave for opposing the Democrats. So I think it's time for me to repeat some of what I said about that issue. In a nutshell, I was part of the pro-life movement for many years before I went into pastoral ministry. So I understand the issue, and I understand the sincere convictions that a lot of people still hold about it. This is a photo my wife found the other day. It's from over 30 years ago, and that's me running a booth at the Minnesota State Fair for the Minnesota Citizens Concerned for Life. I used to do that sort of thing as a volunteer, and my main role was to go into schools and churches to speak about the sanctity of life. This is an issue that's been important to me for my whole life, and it's the main thing that I had to wrestle with in my own opposition to Trump. And that took a long time. And honestly, I'm never going to be completely comfortable with my position on it. It's morally complex, whether we want to admit it or not. And I understand why people on every side of the issue consider it a deal breaker. Every time I talk about it, I seem to find a way to anger people on every side because I think it's a classic case of a deep division that's very personal that can't be entirely solved by politics. But here's the thing. It might be easy to dismiss people who vote based on their pro-life convictions, and it might be easy to say that they don't really care about the babies and that they're all about controlling women's choices. But I was a part of that movement for many years, And I can tell you the people I encountered were very sincere. And the people I volunteered with were mostly women. And the people that I knew around that time were also concerned about the women and the babies after they were born. So they just didn't fit the stereotypes that we hear. Like, for sure, Donald Trump and the politicians who take advantage of these people couldn't care less about the babies. I get that. But in my experience, pro life voters, the ones who are really voting on that issue, are sincere by and large. And we're not going to move forward as a country if we can't find a way to talk to each other about this issue. We might never agree, but we've got to find a way to talk to each other. So that's what I've been trying to do for years. And I just have to say this. When it comes to Kamala Harris, I've been on record with this. I supported Kamala Harris. I donated money to her. I voted for her. And I thought she did as well as she could do in her run against Trump, given all the circumstances she was handed. But the one thing that did bother me about her campaign was how she didn't know quite how to speak to the people that I was speaking to. Every day, I was trying to appeal to people just like myself, people who understood what a threat Donald Trump poses to the nation, but they also have some sincere convictions around the sanctity of life. So I was trying to speak to those people. And I wanted to hear her acknowledge just what a major shift she was asking people to make. I wanted to hear her acknowledge just how hard it is to wrestle through the implications of changing such a deeply ingrained political position. And I'm not criticizing her because she put herself on the line to try to defeat Donald Trump. But I do think on this issue, I think she and her team kind of overplayed their hand on the abortion issue. The 2022 midterms clearly seemed like a referendum on that issue, and the country truly has shifted overwhelmingly to some sort of pro-choice position. And when she talked about it, she did always make a statement about how you don't have to give away your religious convictions to support someone else's right to choose. But I don't think she quite figured out how to engage with the moral complexity of the issue. And I don't blame her for that because it's hard. I'm still trying to figure out how to talk about it. But it might not be fair for me to say this, though. But here's what I think. I think it's become difficult within the Democratic Party to even admit that there's moral complexity at all around the issue. And I don't know how to move forward if we can't at least admit that sincere people could disagree on this issue and that sincere people could be troubled by abortion. So anyway, that's why I'm talking about this again. So I wrote about my journey on this issue at length in both of my books, and I think the best way to handle this today is to just play a video I made during the election last year. What you're going to hear is me reading, the section on abortion from my book, A Christian Case Against Donald Trump. If you haven't heard it before or read it already, then I hope that whatever side of the issue you're on, I hope that this helps you to understand where I'm coming from. And even though I wasn't successful at winning over enough people to make a difference in the election, I still do think these issues are important. And I think we have to find some way to talk to each other about these issues. So this is my best attempt from my book, and thanks for listening. Trump's Demagoguery on Abortion, a Case Study. Just to level set, let's begin with a basic fact that's gone underreported. Donald Trump is running in 2024 as the most pro-choice Republican presidential candidate in decades. He's shown little evidence over the years of having a personal stake in the abortion issue, and now he's reverting to form because the political winds have shifted. His abortion strategy for this election boils down to winking at moderate voters that he's returned to his pro-choice roots while employing demagogic language around late-term abortions to keep the pro-life voters in the camp. So in two destructive ways, Trump has acted as a cultural arsonist regarding the right to life. First, His false, cruel, and callous rhetoric about such a personal issue has only deepened the emotional chasm between the opposing sides. And second, his utter failure to grasp and articulate the core moral and ethical arguments on either side has damaged our ability to reason with one another about a problem of great moral complexity. It's always and only about politics with Trump. It's about posturing and positioning. He's trying to have it both ways. Having awoken the pro-choice movement through his Supreme Court nominations and his boasts about overturning Roe v. Wade, he found it politically expedient for many months afterwards to suggest a compromise version of a national ban. He doesn't understand the issue, so he failed to grasp how fully his compromise proposals undercut the core arguments of both sides. So having lit the fire and fanned the flames, he's now running away from the issue and, quote, leaving it to the states. If he were the sort of pro-life Republican that I used to vote for, I'd say that leaving it to the states could almost be a defensible position. When I helped mobilize around this issue decades ago, my main political goal was to get Supreme Court justices nominated who would eventually overturn Roe. We weren't talking about national bans back then. Perhaps I was misled, and it's clear I'm rethinking many of my past positions, but I strongly believed at the time that Roe was a bad opinion and that it wrongly took power from the states. But the conversation has moved beyond the states. Both sides have now mobilized for battle over a national solution. And neither side believes Trump when he says he's not going to sign a national abortion ban. His track record suggests that he'll do whatever serves his political interests when that moment arrives. So he's de-emphasizing abortion on the one hand, yet he continues his vile rhetoric when he speaks to pro-lifers at rallies. And Trump's divisive political speech, combined with his lack of moral clarity, has led the nation inexorably toward an all-out political fight, a destructive conflict over a sensitive issue that we will not solve through political warfare. And I no longer want any part of that fight. I worked in the pro-life movement for years, and until 2018, I refused to vote for a pro-choice candidate under any circumstances. I still care deeply about lifting the value of human life in our culture, but the Trump years changed me. In many ways, they broke me, and I'm still reassembling myself. His presidency taught me the ultimate futility of trying to address the issue through power politics. Trump has emitted such a noxious cloud around the pro-life message that in the minds of many Americans, the, quote, sanctity of human life sounds like just another weapon in his arsenal, devoid of moral substance, designed only to punish the enemies of MAGA. But while my views on abortion politics have changed, I'd like to make a point that many of my pro-choice friends don't take seriously enough. For most of us who call ourselves pro-life, our motivation really has been always as simple as seeing the unborn child as a human being and trying to figure out what to do about that. I understand that seeing the unborn child as a human being can lead to complex discussions around fetal personhood, which impacts decisions regarding issues like in vitro fertilization or certain forms of birth control. That's one reason I started moving off of my hardline approach many years ago. But I can't completely reconfigure my basic wiring on this issue. I was 7 years old in 1973 when Roe v. Wade came into effect, and I was about 8 years old the first time I heard about it in 1974. I saw a political ad about abortion at my grandparents' house, so I asked my mom what it meant. And she told me, and I decided from then on that I was on the baby's side. But once I was old enough to think more deeply about it, I never considered it to be such a simple case. I felt that it came down to balancing the rights of a woman against the rights of an unborn child, and I've always found that troubling. On most issues, I default heavily to the side of liberty. I'm geared toward increasing freedom of conscience, not limiting it. As I continued to work out my position over the years, I began to recognize God as the one who holds all the rights in the universe. So I increasingly grounded my understanding of human rights in the biblical teaching that each of us is created in the image of God. So when I spoke with secular folks, I might start with the Declaration of Independence and argue that, according to our founders, we're each endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, such as the right to life. And when I spoke to Christians, I'd begin with Genesis 1 and argue that our rights spring directly from our role as God's image bearers on the earth. In each case, though, I taught, and I still believe, that the greatest protection for human beings against exploitation and abuse is to recognize, along with the Declaration of Independence and Genesis 1, that our basic human rights come from somewhere far beyond the reach of mere earthly rulers. Whether that creator is the God of the Bible or an abstract idea that we recognize as part of our shared civic religion, the message is the same. Human beings have intrinsic value, rights, and dignity simply by virtue of being human. And these rights transcend politics. They matter. And balancing those rights against competing rights requires wisdom and grace. So none of this is easy. Even at the height of my political involvement, I never took it lightly that my pro-life position impinged on the bodily autonomy rights of an entire group of people, a group that I didn't belong to. But I couldn't shake my conviction that the unborn child's right to life outweighed the other considerations. So I felt constrained by my conscience to vote for candidates who opposed abortion. I still believe the unborn child is a human being. I don't know how I could see it any other way. But I no longer believe in the wisdom of my old political approach to upholding the sanctity of life. On purely pragmatic grounds, the anti-abortion movement has lost the public argument for at least the next generation. Yet radically anti-Christian candidates like Donald Trump still exploit pro-life Christian voters to get themselves elected. But even if our politics were more favorable to abortion bans, I've changed my mind about the prudence and effectiveness of overly strict measures. By listening to the pro-choice arguments, I've learned more about the negative impact strict abortion laws can have on women's health care, for instance. The legal and medical issues are complex. I've had to adopt a posture of greater humility as I rethink how my basic belief in the sanctity of life, which I still hold, ought to impact my political choices. And I don't have the answers. Once this election is over, I look forward to having the time to develop a more helpful approach to fostering a culture of life in our nation. For example, I listened to a Holy Post podcast a while back, an interview with Angela Wesley from the organization Pro Grace. I was intrigued, and I planned to look more deeply into that organization. On their website, they identify themselves like this: "We are a community advancing a non-political approach to abortion that rises above the divide by demonstrating God's grace and value for all people." That seems like a good place to start. But Trump's rhetoric and the amoral political lens that he applies to the issue has made it more difficult for people to have the sorts of conversations that we ought to have. And by throwing in with a man as odious and transactional as Trump, pro-lifers have sacrificed whatever goodwill they may have built up in the culture. Trump has made it harder to simply talk non-politically about how we can elevate respect for human life at every stage. As someone who spent years speaking about the sanctity of life, I'm appalled by the way Trump exploits the issue. Here he is in the National Religious Broadcaster speech that I mentioned in an earlier chapter.
They're willing to kill the unborn in the 6th and 7th and 8th and 9th months, and even after birth. I mean, even after birth. You remember the governor, that former governor of Virginia, that said the baby will be born and we will decide to kill the baby after birth. We will make a decision with the mother. This is the first time I heard that, but there is legislation in some states where you actually have the right to do that. So they're the radicals.
In no state is it legal to kill the baby after birth. That's called murder, everywhere in America. But Trump repeats this lie again and again because he knows that it packs a powerful emotional punch. And he knows that Americans broadly oppose abortion in the later months of pregnancy after fetal viability. So he feels safe on that rhetorical ground. But the first time I heard Trump talk about late-term abortions, as he calls them, to a rally audience, I felt deeply troubled. I felt troubled by the obvious delight that he took in holding the crowd mesmerized with phrases like, quote, ripping the baby from its mother's womb. When I spoke on pro-life issues years ago, I found talking about the procedure itself quite difficult and sobering. But Trump seems energized by the language, by the vividness of the descriptions, by the power the imagery gives him over his audience. As I've mentioned, the dirty secret is that Trump focuses on abortions later in pregnancy because before he completely gave up and punted the issue to the states, he'd been pushing for a national compromise. And when he floated trial balloon suggestions for a national abortion ban, he talked about setting the allowed gestational age for abortions at either 15 or 16 weeks. This comment was typical. The number of weeks now people are agreeing on 15, and I'm thinking in terms of that. It'll come out to something that's very reasonable. But people are really, even hardliners are agreeing, seems to be 15 weeks, seems to be a number that people are agreeing at. Whether he realizes it or not, this position, which he falsely claims even hardliners agree to, is not very different from life under Roe v. Wade. Roe already allowed for government regulation of abortion after the point of fetal viability, which people often place between 20 and 24 weeks. It's been a while since I worked in the pro-life movement, but we used to have a phrase to describe the type of position Trump advocates. We called it pro-choice. Many Christians have called me a baby killer because I oppose Donald Trump. If they continue to embrace him this year, now that he's adopted a pro-choice stance, I'll just have to ask, was your support for Trump ever really about the babies? Donald Trump's national ban compromise would have only affected abortions after 15 weeks of pregnancy. And according to the Centers for Disease Control, over 96% of abortions occur before the end of the 15th week. So under the various compromises he suggested, over 96% of all abortions would be untouched by his proposed national ban. And a number of the 4% of abortions that might be banned under his compromise would fall under various exceptions, since they sometimes involve heartbreaking health circumstances. So this is where the demagoguery comes into play. Trump's proposed compromise would affect only a small fraction of abortions, smaller than 4%, since many states already have laws against these procedures. So since he's in favor of choice, for all but a tiny fraction of abortions, he uses extreme language to assure his followers that he's really, really opposed to that tiny fraction. According to his rhetoric, that fractional difference between his own position and his opponent's position makes him a righteous defender of life, and his opponent some of the most radically evil human beings on the planet. Mike Pence spoke out forcefully against Trump's abortion stance on July 9th of this year. The Republican National Committee adopted new wording for the party platform to reflect Trump's retreat from abortion as an issue in the upcoming election. Pence said the new platform, quote, removed historic pro-life principles that have long been the foundation of the platform, unquote. According to CNN, Pence called on delegates attending the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee, quote, to restore language to our party's platform, recognizing the sanctity of human life and affirming that the unborn child has a fundamental right to life which cannot be infringed, unquote. A vote for Donald Trump will mean less than nothing for the pro-life movement in 2024. It will ratify Trump's current position that abortion ought to be left completely to the states, and it will generally affirm his pro-choice understanding of where the lines ought to be drawn. So having appointed the justices who overturned Roe, he wants nothing more to do with the issue. He wants pro-life voters to support him in gratitude for what he did in the past, and he wants pro-choice voters to support him because they need not fear what he'll do in the future. Trump doesn't understand a person like Mike Pence, who seems to sincerely believe what he says about abortion. Pence has no choice but to oppose Trump's reasoning. It obliterates the very heart of the pro-life argument that life begins at conception. By so callously throwing out a certain number of weeks as though he's negotiating on the completion date for a new swimming pool at Mar-a-Lago, Trump thoroughly undermines the essence of the pro-life argument. As I've said, I came to see in the wake of the 2016 election that abortion politics has poisoned our nation against itself. I voted third party in 2016 rather than for Hillary Clinton, the pro-choice candidate. But by 2018 midterms, I saw how things worked, and I wish I had seen it sooner. Donald Trump and the GOP hacked the system somewhere along the way. They thought, with good reason, that people like me would never vote for a pro-choice candidate, so they took our votes for granted. They locked us tightly into their fold with this one issue. That meant they could expand their messaging out to an entirely new group of voters, and that new group of voters responded to a different kind of rhetoric, a kind that people like me find revolting and destructive, the rhetoric of anger and grievance and cultural paranoia. Donald Trump shows us every day by his demagogic language toward entire groups of people that his claim to be pro-life means nothing. It's a crass political attempt to purchase the votes of millions of people who, by any moral or ethical standard, ought to have rejected him long ago. Trump's language around abortion has nothing to do with the sanctity of life or an understanding of the image of God in every human being. He tramples on the image of God in his enemies every day. Christian support for Donald Trump under the guise of pro-life issues will be remembered in the years to come as a loathsome chapter in the history of the church.